Chapter 5 Young Princess Charming, USA. Virginia's hands dropped quickly from the yellowed piano keys as she heard her mother call from the dining room. With a frightened look, she slid off the polished bench and walked slowly through the archway. Her cheeks flushed, and she stared sullenly down at the flowered wool rug while Mrs. Ashby read aloud the 6-week grades on the Emerald Empire Academy report card. "Why, Virginia," her mother exclaimed, "what has happened? Until now your grades have always been very good, but these are, why, not one of them is higher than a B, and you actually have a C minus in Spanish and a D in attitude and cooperation." Mrs. Ashby's usually mild gray eyes flashed fire as she looked toward her pretty blonde daughter's turned away head. "Daddy and I shall have a talk over this matter and decide what shall be done," she continued soberly. "But first, I want to hear what you have to say. I feel that it is only fair to give you a chance to explain." Virginia's lips quivered and then pressed tightly together. Her slim fingers clasped and unclasped as she looked through tear-filled eyes at her mother. "There might possibly be some excuse for low grades in your subjects, although right now I can't think what it could be. But there's absolutely no excuse for a D in attitude and cooperation toward your kind teachers. Surely Daddy and I have failed somehow in our training, or this would not have happened." "Oh, it's not your fault, Mother, or Dad's either. Honestly, it isn't. Both of you have always been willing to help me with my homework whenever I ask. And you've always tried to teach me to be polite. But it's just everything. You wouldn't understand how a girl feels." Virginia burst forth stormily. "Wouldn't I?" half smiled Mrs. Ashby. "I believe I would. Once upon a time I was a girl, you know. Come on, dear. Sit down beside me at the table. You talk, and I'll listen carefully. I'll try to be fair in my judgment." "Well," Virginia began, "it's just everything all at once. All the other girls seem to get by in their classes without a lot of extra work, and yet they have plenty of time for fun, and they get to go to parties and picnics all the time, too. I've studied faithfully to get good grades. At least I have until lately. When examinations are given, I try to be honest, but when it's all over, I find I haven't done as well as some of the students do who cheat and copy the right answers." A little sob caught in Virginia's aching throat, and she stopped for an instant. "I'm simply tired of all those dull subjects, English and algebra and history, and above all, cooking and Spanish. And I'm sick and tired of always being asked to help out in church programs, or to play a piano solo, or to help with the junior Dorcas. I'm I'm tired of being polite and helpful. I just want to have fun." Mrs. Ashby put her comforting arm around Virginia's shoulders and laid her cheek against her daughter's tousled curls. "Perhaps you're trying to do too much, my dear, and it might be well to drop out of some of the school affairs and parties for a while, for you must keep up your classwork and your music. Those are first in importance. As for your Spanish, well, I'm keenly disappointed. You must remember that a foreign language, well learned, may someday be very helpful to you. You've always thought you wanted to be a nurse. If you are, you'll probably have a chance to work among Spanish speaking people, either in the United States or abroad. Right now, you can learn the proper accent from your many years from your new teacher. He just returned to Oregon after spending many years in Peru, South America. And yet, you are wasting this opportunity. Mrs. Ashby looked at Virginia's reddened eyes and tear-stained cheeks before she calmly made her decision. Yes, she said firmly, I think that for a while you must give up some of the social activities arranged by the various school clubs. Virginia raised a horrified face. She stared wildly at her mother. Give up the school parties and the MV hikes and club meetings? Why, mother, I can't do that, she wailed. Right now, I'm not allowed to go to half as many things as the other girls are. And even when I do go, I'm never allowed to have a date. Daddy always takes me and comes to get me before anyone else has to leave. It's it's downright well, it's downright embarrassing, mother. You really have no idea just how awfully embarrassing it is. Her voice shook, and her eyes brimmed with tears, but she could not hold back the torment of rushing words. No wonder the older girls laugh at me behind my back. I have to come right home after school and practice my music lesson. Then I always help with dinner while Winona practices on her violin. Most of the other girls don't have to do all those things. Jane and Doris always walk downtown after school. They stop at the corner inn for a malted milk or a chocolate sundae. Their folks don't care when they get home or what they eat between meals, and not one of them has to go to bed until 10 or 11 o'clock or later. But I have to be in bed by 9 o'clock on school nights, just like a baby. Why, I'm almost 15, and you and Daddy treat me as if I were a little girl. Oh, how I wish I'd been born a princess, a real princess. Then I'd be able to do exactly as I pleased and whenever I pleased. I wouldn't have to be polite or obligating to anyone unless I wanted to. I could have a whole closet full of beautiful dresses and furs, in rows and rows of pretty shoes and slippers. And best of all, there'd be no school lessons except when I wanted to study. No cooking classes, no music, no history, and no Spanish. Mrs. Ashby's eyes twinkled as she kissed her young daughter. I think I know what is wrong with you, my dear, she chuckled. You have a bad case of psoriasis, but it needs only a simple treatment for a cure. Before we get up and start dinner, I'm going to give you this necessary medicine in form of a story. But first I want to be quite sure that I understand you. Did you see that if you were a real princess, you would have no work that you were compelled to do, no classroom lessons or music practices, no duties of any kind, no committee work? Is that correct? Yes, it is, nodded Virginia. Oh, of course, I'd have to study some, I know, but wouldn't choose the dull subjects that I have now. And there wouldn't be so many of them either. Besides, just think of the freedom I'd have. I could go where I pleased and when I pleased. It would be simply wonderful. That's an interesting conclusion, said Mrs. Ashby. I'm sure I understand what you're trying to say, Virginia, even though you sound as though you wanted to live in a dream world. However, I've learned that real life doesn't seem to permit one to succeed by taking the line of least resistance. Success comes through hard work and stern discipline. This was brought very forcibly to my attention last week when I noticed an article in the evening paper about 18-year-old Princess Anne and her brother, Prince Charles, who is heir to the throne of England. I was so interested in the account that I went upstairs to the attic and found the old scrapbook in which years ago I had pasted a number of news stories and articles about a real Princess Charming of those earlier days. It is her story that I'm going to tell you now. When I'm through, I want you to decide who has the more carefree life, you or this young princess, continued Mrs. Ashba. Virginia drew a long breath and wiped the tears from her eyes. Then she settled back in her chair, for she always enjoyed her mother's stories. When little Princess Charming was quite small, her beautiful Queen Mother gave her the first reading and writing lessons that she ever had. But before very long, Nanny, the Queen's own childhood governess, became the young child's teacher. At the age of 7, little Princess Charming moved from the nursery to the palace classroom. Here she and her older sister were taught by the very fine university graduate from Scotland, Miss Crawford. Their affectionate name for her was Crawfie, and she was not only their teacher, but their trusted friend. Their classes met every day but Sunday. The classes were held from 9:30 to 1, with a short recess at 11 o'clock. Did she have to go to school 6 days a week? Exclaimed Virginia. Yes, indeed she did. Are you already surprised at the working hours of a small princess who has nothing to do but have a good time? Laughed Mrs. Ashba. It's quite true that classes were held 6 days a week, and compared with their classes, your 6 school subjects appear easy. You seem to think that just one foreign language, Spanish, is difficult. But this Princess Charming and her older sister studied 3 foreign languages, German, French, and Latin. In addition, they had mathematics, English, geography and history, the scriptures, music and art, government and statecraft problems, and public speaking. That makes 13 classes so far, burst forth Virginia, wide-eyed. How could any girl hold so many things in her head without getting them all jumbled together? Oh, that isn't all, Mrs. Ashby said calmly. There is much more to the education of a Princess Charming than what is found in books. A princess must be taught queenly behavior from the time she is very small. This princess and her older sister were not allowed to slouch down in their schoolroom seats, and I'm sure they were never allowed to chew gum or to answer indifferently or rudely when their teacher asked them questions. These little girls could not even sit down to recite. They had to stand very straight during long schoolroom recitations, holding their bodies in proper standing position. I can't imagine what it would be like to always jump up out of my seat to recite, mused Virginia thoughtfully. Sometimes we stand up, but more often we don't. I should think the princess would get awfully tired and cross. I'm sure she couldn't always be polite to her teacher. I know I'm not always very polite to mine. Why, Virginia, this young princess always had to be polite. Never, never, under any circumstances whatsoever, was she allowed to act bored and impatient. She might long to be in her own suite of rooms reading a good book, or she might long to be out in the gardens with her sister, whom she loved very deeply. But no matter what her own wishes were, she was required to perform the tasks that were necessary at a given time and to listen politely and with interest to what was being said. She was never allowed to forget the true meaning of such words as bravery, unselfishness, courage, kindness, self-control, tact, and service to our people. She simply couldn't have been human to do all that, cried Virginia. I don't know any girl today who has to study and work that hard. She surely couldn't have had any fun at all. Oh, but she did, Virginia, for she had a very wise mother and father. The king and queen had been very careful to teach their two daughters that true happiness comes from serving others. They had been instructed to think first of the welfare of others and to act natural and kind. Thus they were not at all self-conscious about themselves, and this gave them real charm in their manners. They were dearly loved by all who met them. And as for fun, the princess did all the things that you have been allowed to do. She had a little playhouse, only hers, was at the Royal Lodge country home instead of by the corner of the family garage, as your playhouse when you were small. She worked in her flower garden just as you work in yours, and she learned to ride horseback as you learned at your grandfather's ranch. Like you, she studied piano. However, she began when she was 7 years old. Though she was well grounded in classical music, it was said that she was very adept at playing any melody she had heard only once, and could add numerous variations of her own to the original tune. She enjoyed playing duets with her older sister, and you play the accompaniments for your younger sister's violin solos. She also spent quite a good share of her not too large allowance for records, just as you do. And in their younger years, she and her sister loved to dress up in long, lacy costumes. I have no doubt that they must have pretended to be playing princesses, just as you and Winona used to do when you were children. In later years, they helped with the annual Christmas entertainment of the royal household, just as you and your sister help with the holiday programs planned by the Missionary Volunteer Group. But didn't this princess ever get away from home to see friends her own age? Did she have to stay right in the palace all the time? Couldn't she come and go as she pleased? That is, if there was any time left after studying all those 13 subjects? Questioned Virginia. You must remember, Virginia, that a princess is not free to come and go as she pleases. Young Princess Charming used to feel these restrictions very keenly, for she longed to learn about people by getting out and mingling with them. During the war years, for reasons of safety, she and her older sister were sent away from London to Windsor Castle. There she continued her Girl Guide activities, and in the summer she was permitted to camp out with the group. She loved this and would gladly have visited the girls in their homes, had she been permitted to do so. But of course, this was not possible. So actually, she had a few close friends her own age. However, when in camp, she willingly helped with her share of the cooking and dishwashing and general work. She also passed the life-saving tests, which showed that she was a good swimmer. In addition to this, she belonged to clubs and often spoke before welfare and youth groups. That begins to sound a little more exciting, sighed Virginia. I was beginning to think that she had all work and no play. But there's something you haven't mentioned, Mother, and that's about her clothes. Didn't she have a lot of pretty dresses and hats and shoes? I think she would, for surely a princess must be rich. I imagine that during the war years she had less clothing than you do now, dear, for at that time all clothing was very strictly rationed. She had a few plain, well-tailored suits, hand-me-downs from her older sister. In addition, she had sweaters and tweed skirts and sturdy walking shoes. However, when it became possible for her to enlarge her wardrobe, she had to be very careful in her selection, for English girls her age tried to copy her costumes. So you can understand that she had to be a leader in demonstrating what was good taste and proper wearing apparel for an English miss. She used no makeup and did not need it, with her smooth, lovely skin. And for some time her only jewelry was a plain pearl necklace to which her father, the king, added one pearl on each birthday. Just one more question, please, Mother. If this princess was as old as I am, surely she had dates, as most my girlfriends do. You haven't mentioned one word about it, though. This sweet Princess Charming was older than you, Virginia. She was past 16, but she did not have what you call dates. Those were put aside until she was older and had finished her schooling. She was beginning to go to various concerts, art exhibits, benefits, or garden parties and weddings, but she was always escorted by a reasonable older person, just as you are escorted by Daddy, who takes you to a party and calls for you when it's time to come home. You see, my dear, the king and queen had her best interest at heart, just as Daddy and I have for you and your sister. They wanted her to grow up simply and naturally and quite unspoiled. They wanted her to be sweet and girlish while she was still a young girl. They wanted her to study hard and prepare herself for all the heavy responsibilities, cares, and joys that would come to her as a member of the royal family when she was grown. For this young Princess Charming was the younger sister of the most important girl in the powerful British Empire. This was Princess Margaret Rose, who at that time was next to her older sister, Princess Elizabeth, in the line of succession to the English throne. Do you wonder that her wise parents were very, very careful in guarding and in guiding those two beautiful young English princesses? Virginia slowly shook her head. Her eyes had a dazed look as she stared into space. At last she spoke. I never dreamed that a real princess had to work as hard as that, she said. Why, Mother, I don't, I didn't know that she had to do any work at all. And yet she worked 10 times harder than I've been doing. I know. In spite of her many duties, she was always sweet and polite. It it really makes me ashamed of the way I've grumbled about my lessons and scolded at you and Daddy and felt like scolding my teachers. Quickly she turned to wide-eyed Winona, who had heard the conclusion of the story. Here, sis, she said, give me your apron. I'm going right out and start getting dinner. I want you and Mother to find any old articles and pictures about Princess Margaret Rose that you can in Mother's box of clippings. I'm going to paste them in my scrapbook, and when I feel myself slipping back into my old habits, I'll reread them. I've made up my mind that from this minute on, I'll study so hard and act so nice that all my friends and everyone who meets me will Miss, call me Princess Charming Virginia of Eugene, Oregon, USA.